So we've been getting a lot of great questions in the chat box, and we've had some questions on Facebook. As I said, a number of folks wrote in some questions in advance, so I'm just going to kind of go through some of them. To start with the folks that are actually here with us online, there was a number of great questions that came in for all of our speakers. So to try to balance things out a little bit, one of the questions from Facebook was specifically related to members of the work release program that might have been participating in cleanup or response. So the question was the Gulf long-term study follow-up able to include as participants prisoners from the work release programs who were part of the cleanup and response?
So I'm not sure if Dale wants to answer that question, but basically the way that workers and non-workers were identified were from working rosters collected across all agencies, so federal agencies, volunteer lists, anything that the PIs could get their hands on in terms of contacting folks. I'm not sure, Dale, if you want to clarify, do you know if we were able to reach the prisoners work program?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. We do not have the ability to answer that. So we had these lists of workers, and there was no specific, if somebody was a worker and on somebody's general volunteer list, a prisoner and on a volunteer list, they could have been enrolled in the study if they responded to our outreach. But I actually tend to believe that we probably do not have many such individuals in the study.
Okay, thank you both for that. So Brian, one of the questions that came up during your talk was talking about during the UAS plume sampling event, where we see the concentrations along the drone's path, was there an emission cloud that could be seen and followed at that time, or were there clear skies?
Yeah, there was a nice day, so the skies were clear. The plume, usually it depends on the source, but it dissipates fairly quickly, and that's why it's really handy to have the telemetry system supplying carbon dioxide concentrations down to the ground. So obviously whenever the CO2 is above about 400 ppm, you know you're in the plume. But many times it's hard to see where the drone is in relationship to the plume. So it could be on the far side of the plume in clean air. And so that's why it's nice to have the telemetry system. So the answer is yes, sometimes you can follow the plume, but it depends upon the source and the color of the plume.
Thanks, Brian. And for you, Karen, I've kind of a two-part question from one of our Zoom participants. The first question, it seems like it's a regulatory question about how oil companies are actually fined or accounted for filing a response, whether or not the fact that these things are being burned out there somehow interferes with the accounting of the amount of oil that is spilled as a first part. And the second part of the question of kind of wanting to know whether or not the use of dispersant changes the types of particles that are being created when you're burning from here, and somehow does the dispersants make particles smaller or potentially more transmittable to shoreline populations? A little two-part question.
All right, so the first part about the burning and accounting for the oil, we actually, from lots of experiments over the years, we are able to estimate the surface area of the burn. We have an approximation of the thicknesses, and we know how much oil is being burned per minute. So we're able to capture all of that for the overall oil budget. So that's the first part of the question. The second part regarding dispersants and the burning of oil, typically there are two separate response tools. So for Deepwater Horizon, we had aerial dispersants applied, and we also had the subsea dispersants that were applied later on during the response effort. So most of the times when that oil was available, or it actually didn't surface, it wasn't available to be burned. So pretty much what we were burning, for the most part, was untreated oil that had not been dispersed.
Okay, thank you. So there's another question that I think could kind of go to a couple of you. There's questions about work being done next to population centers and whether or not burning of a large oil spill is appropriate for locations that might be adjacent to high density populations. Are there particulates from burning a better choice than the evaporative components in terms of human health?
I can answer part of that. So what we do for in situ burning, there's sort of an unwritten rule that we do not practice in situ burning within 3 miles of population centers. Okay, so it's nowhere near, and that's also sort of where the federal operation takes place. The state, for some of the marsh burns and all that, they have different regulations, but for the most part, for offshore burns, we keep it greater than 3 miles out so that we don't impact any federal or any populated areas. However, that burner technology that I shared with you, again, we have the data, we have the science, and we know how much the emissions are reduced. So we feel confident that we might be able to use that type of technology closer into population centers.
So Dr. Lawrence or Dr. Sandler, then, is it the potential or particulate matter coming off of a burn? Is that more or less harmful to people versus those other VOCs that might be coming through the evaporative process of oils?
So I can chime in here, and then maybe I'll let Good. Dale, go ahead. Do you want to start?
Oh, I was going to say it's actually a very challenging question because the levels of the, oil itself or the evaporative products of the oil itself that reached the shore were incredibly low and difficult to even assess in terms of community and neighborhood exposures. And so we're talking about low-level exposures in both cases about the, and how the wind is blowing and where people were relative to the burning. And so it would be very challenging for us to come up with a relative risk assessment in thinking about this. We consider these health effects separately. And I want to make it clear that we were studying the workers, and we focused on the workers because we thought that their exposures would be greater than the exposures to the communities at large. The answer to the question about where the burning takes place, it's offshore by design, and so how much of the particulate matter reached beyond that is, difficult to say, but probably not much.
Okay, so Brian, there was a question for you whether or not you've had issues with prop wash using the UAS.
Yeah, thanks, Missy. That's a pretty common question. So I will say that we compared emission measurements from an industrial facility with concurrent stack measurements. So we used a drone to measure downwind, and we also looked at the CEM measurements, the continuous emission monitors from the plant. And they were within 3 to 5% of each other. So for gases, I am absolutely confident there's no problem whatsoever. There's no prop wash effect. I'm less certain at this point for particles because a lot of the particle collection devices depend upon inertial impaction and separation of the particles. My inclination is that for very small particles, it makes no difference. We still have to fully vet that and understand it. We're planning to test that this year if possible, but my previous indication is that it has little effect also on particles.
Okay, and being mindful of people's time and knowing that people are going to have to fall away, I am going to be looking through additional questions that might have popped up along the way and any of the ones through the registration page, and we'll be trying to get that information back out to everyone. One of the questions that came up was whether or not there will be any summary of the question and answering. We know that everything that's being shown to you right now is being recorded and can be still made available online afterwards for you to go back and listen to these questions again. I will be trying to compile these questions and see if I can get those answers from our panelists and speakers today and post those along with the videos associated with this webinar link on the Gulf Sea Grant oil spill page. As I said, we are going to be having parts 2 and 3 coming up over the next month or two this summer. I will be sending out email blasts to all of those that participated in this particular webinar, and those of you that are a part of our newsletters or get your information on oil spill science from some of our different partner sites. So you will be kept informed of when parts 2 and 3 are occurring, but we do have some other great webinars that some of my colleagues on the team are putting together, talking about marine snow, looking at impacts of oysters, and other things that we are learning about in the Gulf as GOMRI comes to the end of its 10-year legacy. So I appreciate you all joining us today. Thank you to our speakers and panelists for taking the time and for sharing your science and sharing your afternoon with us. And we look forward to doing this again and hosting one of these again soon. So thank you all very much.